Right. Well, welcome everybody. I think we'll go ahead and get started. It's 3:01 p.m. I am very excited to welcome Dr. Holly Stevens to this virtual space of the Virtual University of Virginia to give this talk. This talk is posted as part of the University of Virginia East Asia Center Speaker Series, and we're very excited to have Dr. Stevens join us. Dr. Stevens, by way of introduction, received her undergraduate degree at the University of Durham, the United Kingdom, and received her PhD in history from University of Pennsylvania in 2017. The talk she'll be giving today, Cotton, Capital, and Colonialism in Southern Korea, 1910 to 1945, comes from some of the exciting research she's doing for her current manuscript in progress, which is tentatively titled Empire by Association: The Reorganization of the Rural Economy in Modern Korea. So Dr. Stevens, as you can tell by the title of her presentation, her manuscript in progress, her research interests include economic history, history of empire, everyday life, and agriculture in Korea and the Japanese Empire. And really exciting recent article just to kind of highlight this, because I thought this work was fantastic. Holly, or Dr. Stevens, she recently published an article on history of economic thought. Y'all can look up Rice Cycles and Price Cycles, Local Knowledge and Global Trade in Korea, 1870 to 1933, where she uses the diaries written by farmers in colonial era Korea to see how they themselves understood some of the massive economic changes and market fluctuations that were happening as they themselves became imbricated in a global market for rice. And so yeah, I think that covers everything. So Dr. Stevens, again, we're really happy to have, looks like 48, I'm looking now, 48 participants. So really excited so many people could join us for this talk. And Dr. Stevens, take it away.
All right, I'll see if I can remember how to share my screen. There we go. I hope everybody can see that. Okay, well, yes, thank you so much for the kind introduction and the invitation to be here. I'm very happy to share my research with you all today, and I look forward to your comments and questions at the end of the talk as well. So my talk today is titled Cotton, Capital, and Colonialism in Southern Korea. And in exploring the development of cotton cultivation in colonial Korea, I really want to focus on thinking through the role of some of the semi-governmental organizations that existed under colonial rule in structuring the changes to the rural economy. Now, before I get started talking about cotton, I briefly want to explain why I'm focusing on cotton rather than rice, which is, of course, one of the most well-known aspects of Japanese agricultural policies in colonial Korea, right? The attempt to increase both the production and export of rice to Japan. Well, at the most basic level, it's precisely because rice has dominated the existing research into colonial agriculture. Other crops like cotton have been overlooked to some extent in the research. There are a small number of studies of cotton, mostly available in the Korean language scholarship. But cotton, too, it was a major target of colonial policies throughout the period of Japanese rule. And so understanding the importance of cotton within colonial agriculture and its place within the broader pattern of the rural economy, it's an important correction and addition to our understanding of colonial agriculture. And in particular, the examination of colonial cotton policies highlights some of the major trends in the colonial rural economy, especially, as I will talk about today, the expansion and influence of semi-governmental organizations in the implementation of colonial policy, as well as also the selective application and promotion of novel forms of scientific and commercial agriculture as a mechanism by which the colonial government attempted to change cultivation practices within Korea. And so there's an important distinction that I want to make throughout my talk between the goals of colonial policy and the methods that the government employed to try and achieve those goals. So the goal would be the increase in the cultivation and export of cotton, but the method then is seen in the selective application of scientific and commercial agricultural practices implemented through the semi-governmental organizations. And this distinction, it sounds obvious, but it's worth making because this helps us recognize some of the broader impacts and legacies of colonial rule. And indeed, on one level, we could make the argument that the goal to establish Korea as a source of raw cotton for the Japanese textile industry utterly failed. Korea was never more than a negligible source of raw cotton imports for Japan. The scale demanded by the textile industry was just too high. Nonetheless, the practices that were adopted in support of this goal had their own impact on cultivation practices and rural households' relationship to the broader economy. As well as this then connection to Japan and the impact of the imperial economy on households, we can also see through cotton the influence of international markets. And all of these aspects are visible through the work of the semi-governmental organizations. Especially, I'll be talking today about the cotton cultivation associations, Myeonjakjohap, or Mensaku Kumiai in Japanese. And these, in 1926, these ceased to exist. However, they get rolled into the County Agricultural Association, the Nokai or Nonghae. And this, though it's not that the work ends, it just continues under this different form. So be aware that there's a change in the name of the organization, even though we see the continued encouragement of cotton through very similar practices. And this type of semi-governmental organization, I'll be talking about cotton associations, but we can see semi-governmental organizations much more broadly across the colonial Korean economy. We can find semi-governmental organizations related to finance, irrigation, sericulture, livestock, hygiene. I'd be very happy to talk about this broader trend in the discussion afterwards if this is of interest to you. But in looking at their role in the cotton policies, I want to just show today how important the colonial government's role was and how active it was in encouraging changes in the rural economy. And this is a really important argument because if we look at previous research into colonial agriculture, so specifically rice agriculture, there's often an emphasis on the overlapping interests that emerge between landlords, the colonial government, and Japanese capitalism. And so the colonial government, it introduces new sources of finance and it recognizes land ownership and introduces favorable policies that favor land ownership that then enables the accumulation of wealth among a minority of elite landlords. And so this is one of the standard narratives that you'll find often about the earliest colonial rule. Interestingly, this also aligns to some extent with some of the more apologetic narratives that also try to explain the changes in the colonial economy. In particular, Mitsuhiko Kimura, a Japanese scholar, studied cotton policies and argued that the growth of cotton, it was a rational response on the part of cultivators who were seeking higher prices. And he argues that, there's very little coercion. The growth of cotton, it was simply a result of higher profits from cotton grown as a commercial crop. What's interesting, though, is that both of these narratives overlooks the role of the colonial state and the colonial government in shaping the transactions and incentives in the rural economy. And so that's what I want to highlight today through this examination of cotton cultivation and the role of the cotton associations. Because where previous research, there is already some discussion of these semi-governmental organizations. However, they have tended to be portrayed as landlord organizations, right, existing to further the interests of landlords, with colonial agricultural policies, such as the program to increase rice production, understood as run by and for landlords and capitalists, to use Kim Young-sup's words. And so, along this line of argument, a lot of the existing research, it might take this example here of the Cotton Association membership form and look at the background of Lee Hyuk-il and see how he was able to enrich himself by participating in this Cotton Association. I'm not going to do that today. That's not because this is entirely inaccurate. A lot of the early membership of the semi-governmental organizations, it was drawn from landlords and wealthier farming households. So I'm not trying to deny that. However, as the case of cotton reveals, a lot of the activities of the semi-governmental organizations, they're not primarily focused on promoting landlords' interests, and instead we can see them revealing the active intervention and indeed construction of a state presence in the rural economy to reshape even landlords' agricultural practices in line with imperial objectives. Furthermore, if we focus as well on some of the methods, especially the promotion of new modes of scientific and commercial agriculture through the semi-governmental organizations as the means by which the colonial government is trying to achieve its goal, it shows a much broader range of interaction between farming households and an expanding colonial state, and the multiple terms on which farming households become drawn into interaction with colonial policy and the colonial state. So the semi-governmental organizations, they're not only a vehicle for the economic interest of their members, but they also provide access for seed varieties developed in the model industrial farm, access to knowledge, as well as regulating the production and sale of cotton at the local level. And this then, I argue, that is establishing a new pattern of state interaction in agriculture, where the government plays a very important role in promoting quote unquote improved and scientific practices, with agricultural technicians advising and overseeing individual cultivation at the household level. And this will continue into the post-colonial period as well. So, getting back to cotton, the Japanese interest in Korea as a source of raw cotton preceded annexation. As early as 1902, the Japanese consul in Mokpo, Wakamatsu Saburo, began experimenting with the cultivation of new strains of cotton with the hope of finding a viable source of raw cotton for the textile industry. And he continued a series of experiments with the support of Japanese politicians, bureaucrats, and representatives of the spinning industry, which was one of the important drivers of early industrialization in Japan. But the promotion of cotton cultivation really took off after the establishment of Korea as a Japanese colony. In March 1912, Governor General Teruichi Masatake published a directive that listed 5 specific areas for the promotion of cotton cultivation, namely the promotion of American upland cotton over local varieties. So moving from the image on the left here, Josephium arboreum, to Josephium hirsutum, American upland cotton. The other areas targeted in this directive were the preservation of upland cotton seeds, again, very related to the promotion of upland cotton, encouraging farmers to keep the new seeds and use them again in future years, as well as the extension of official guidance on the cultivation of upland cotton, expanding its cultivation in the 6 southern provinces. And this was the area considered climatically suitable for upland cotton cultivation. It didn't grow as well in the northern and western provinces. So the 6 southern provinces become the main target of these cotton policies, although there are some methods to improve existing cotton cultivation in other areas. That's the final target. And these targets listed on the directive, specifically the promotion of American upland cotton, they're very clearly designed to suit the interests of textile manufacturers. American upland cotton, it was chosen not only for its high yield, but also for its long staple fiber, right? The threads within the cotton ball there. And this makes it better suited for industrial spinning and weaving processes than did the existing Josephium arboreum, which had much shorter staple fibers. And the 5 targets in Teruichi's directive, they would then become the basis for a series of multi-year cotton promotion plans that introduce specific targets for increasing the yield and acreage of upland cotton cultivation that you can see here. So the first plan was just for the period between 1912 to 1918, with a target of 125,000 hectares. The second plan built on that, increasing to 250,000 hectares. And then after a small delay, which we'll talk about, the third cotton promotion plan increased that target yet again to 350,000. Actually, this third plan, it was the first stage of a 2-step plan that actually aimed to increase cultivation to 500,000 hectares by the early 1950s, although, of course, that didn't happen. And you can see here on the graph, it shows the targets against the actual acreage of cotton planted according to the statistical yearbook of the colonial government. I should mention that the figures here, they are national figures. So for the whole of the peninsula, so where you see the continued cultivation of local cotton in pink, that's very concentrated in the northern and western provinces where upland cotton cultivation wasn't being promoted. Actually, by 1918, the 93% of all of the cotton grown in the 6 southern provinces was upland cotton. So this is quite a big and thorough transformation of cotton cultivation. And much of the work in implementing the policies and targets produced by the Government General was carried out via the cotton associations. Shortly after the publication of the 1912 directive, the South Challa provincial governor announced a plan to establish cotton associations, with the other southern provinces following suit to establish similar organizations the following years. By 1922, 10 years after the publication of the directive, associations existed across the southern provinces with a total reported membership of 642,265. Now, in general, the cotton associations corresponded to local administrative units, generally at the county level, with local government officials often serving as the head of the organization and playing a role in establishing the organization at the very beginning. All of the cotton cultivators within the district of a given cotton association then automatically were treated as members of the association. And so that's the semi-governmental aspect, because the members are also then filling subsidiary leadership roles within the associations. And the associations, they play a very practical role in distributing resources, such as upland cotton seeds obtained from the model industrial farm. They also provide members with financial support, low interest credit through the state-managed agricultural and industrial bank. They also facilitated the purchase of fertilizers and tools. They also hosted agricultural technicians who visited the cotton associations to raise awareness about the new crop through lectures and promotional campaigns, providing education on new techniques or techniques suited to the new plant, as well as hosting product fairs where farmers might win prizes for the best cotton crop. And so this image here, this is the reverse of the certificate earlier, of Ichogil's membership certificate. And you can see here on the third point, there are instructions for Ichogil on how many seeds he needs to save each year for planting. So this is a relatively early image. There's no date, but because of the emphasis on the seed preservation, we can assume that it's relatively early on. Because as well, after several years of cotton cultivation, the agricultural technicians, they noticed a tendency for the upland cotton seeds to become diluted over time. And so the cotton associations, they also started to implement and oversee rolling seed exchange programs, operating seed propagation fields, and then periodically every 5 years or so, they would exchange member seeds. So they would receive all of the member seeds and then give them a new batch of upland cotton seeds in order to maintain the yield and the desirable characteristics of upland cotton. And by the government's own estimation, the cotton associations were the chief mechanism for influencing cotton production within Korea. One report from South Challa province stated in 1926, it is no exaggeration to say that cotton promotion in this province is carried out entirely through the cotton associations. Although almost at the point that this was being written, from 1926, the cotton associations get merged into the new county agricultural associations. Much of the same work continues unchanged. The agricultural associations continue to be organized at the county level. They employ specialized technicians to oversee the promotion and cultivation of upland cotton in each area. However, the work of the cotton and later agricultural associations, it went far beyond the simple expansion of upland cotton cultivation. The educational work carried out by the associations, it didn't just focus on distributing the new strain of seeds and telling farmers how to grow it, but it also attempted to influence farmers' cultivation practices. And we can see here the competitive fairs. This is a poster advertising a fair where farmers can win up to 100 yen for the best submission of cotton. And these competitive fairs, they were often judged according to the elements that were prized by industrial purchasers of cotton as a raw material in textile manufacturing. So cotton would receive high marks for the quality, color, moisture content, the level of processing of the cotton, removing the cotton seeds, etc., as well as the length of fibers. All of these were pretty much aligned with what industrial manufacturers were looking for in high quality cotton. The associations, they also encouraged households to engage in the commercial cultivation of cotton. And one of the ways that they did this was by discouraging the practice of intercropping. So often in Korea, cotton would be planted alongside another field crop, often barley. And so you'd have both crops in the same field, and then you'd harvest them, the barley, and then the cotton would continue to grow. And this would be done, it enables the maximal usage of the field as well. However, this was very discouraged by colonial officials. You can see in this poster, one of the preconditions to even enter this competition, to win the prize money, is down here in the little circle at the bottom, kanhonjaki opsum. Like there's no intercropping in order to enter this competition. Often, though, colonial officials, they recognized that it was impossible to eliminate intercropping entirely because the barley was an important crop for the peasants. And so one of the other aspects that the colonial policy or colonial technicians would do is that they would prioritize cotton. So when the intercropping continued to exist, they made sure to prioritize cotton by promoting barley cutting day. So putting that in the calendar earlier than the farmers would otherwise cut their barley, in order to lengthen the growing cycle of the cotton and then boost the yield. And both of these objectives then, there was to increase the yield and favor the production of cotton as a raw material for sale, rather than the alternative, which would be the important subsistence crop, barley, grown for household consumption. The cotton associations, they were also integral in establishing the self-regulation of members. And so sometimes this was done through incentives, such as through these competitive fairs, but there were often more coercive measures. In 1925, the Donghae Ilbo reported on a case in Yanggwang Cotton Association, so South Gyeongsang Province. And in this incident, Mr. Shim, who was an employee of the Cotton Association, he led 2 township clerks and 20 students from the local school to inspect the Cotton Association members' fields. And on discovering a field of intercropped cotton, the group reportedly leapt into the field and violently destroyed the crop for violating the association's rules on intercropping. Now, this episode, interestingly, stands in contrast to the comments from Japanese officials. So in 1935, as part of a retrospective celebration of 25 years of colonial rule, a number of the early agricultural technicians, they held a discussion which was printed in the journal, the Bulletin of the Agricultural Association, where they're reminiscing about the early years of colonial agricultural policies and colonial rule, and talking quite candidly about some of the extreme measures that they adopted in order to promote the early adoption of upland cotton cultivation. Some of the extreme strategies that the cotton technicians remembered included bribery, as well as beating farmers who refused to plant the unfamiliar upland cotton seeds, as well as one figure who made sure to destroy the existing cotton crop in such a way that the farmer had no seeds, right? It was totally impossible for the farmer to replant his field after the official had destroyed his cotton crop, leaving him no option then but to accept the new seeds. However, after recounting all of these extreme strategies, the colonial officials proudly remarked that these practices were unimaginable from the vantage point of the 1930s. However, as the Yanggwang account suggests, it's not that such practices were no longer continuing, but the regulation of cotton cultivation, it had simply shifted to the purview of the cotton associations, which continued to regulate and enforce colonial priorities, even sometimes through violent means. The final major activity of the cotton associations was the regulation of cotton sales. Members were required to sell any cotton not used within their household via the associations. And again, going back to the reverse of Gil's certificate here, you can see that on the second figure, he has to present his certificate when he's selling cotton through the associations. And as much as this requirement, like it's quite clearly an attempt to control and direct the flow of cotton toward favored purchasers. However, it's worth noting also that the regulatory work of the associations, it applied as much to cotton traders who required the approval of colonial officials in order to purchase cotton from the associations. And so in this way, the colonial government, through the semi-governmental organizations, is also attempting to regulate the activities of cotton traders that might undermine the value of Korean cotton as a raw material. So it explicitly prohibited practices such as mixing different varieties of cotton, right? The existing cotton with the upland cotton in order to take advantage of the higher value of upland cotton, or artificially manipulating the weight of the cotton being sold by adding moisture to it, etc. All of these were prohibited. Despite the expansion and the rapid expansion, I should say, of the cultivation of upland cotton, there were still some limits that we can see to the colonial government's cotton promotion policies. And the first major limitation can be seen as a result of the assumptions embedded within the colonial government's cotton policies. In 1912, Governor General Terauchi framed the cultivation of upland cotton as something that would be mutually beneficial for both Korea and Japan, with Japanese textile manufacturers benefiting from the development of a new secure supply of raw cotton, while individual farmers and the Korean economy as a whole would theoretically profit from the cultivation and sale of a new commercial crop. Now, this turned out to be wishful thinking on Terauchi's part. As I mentioned, the scale of Japanese cotton imports, and then Korea never provided anything other than a negligible share of Japan's cotton imports. And the assumption that the cotton cultivation would bring economic benefits to Korean farmers was also highly questionable. Indeed, in the early years of cotton promotion policies, agricultural technicians commented on the difficulties that they faced in persuading farmers of the benefits of upland cotton. In some years, when prices fluctuated and the system of cotton sales through the associations, it was still in its early stages, the price of the existing cotton varieties was sometimes higher than the price of the upland cotton, leading cultivators to treat the associations with indifference and aversion. It's worth noting too that the promotion of upland cotton, it was dependent on government subsidies, a wide range of government subsidies to support many of the essential activities that supported cotton cultivation. There were subsidies for the salaries of the technicians, the operation of the seed propagation fields that provided the seeds to farmers, the association's activities, hosting lectures, promoting upland cotton through posters and photo displays, the prizes at the product fairs, for example, as well as subsidies for fertilizer purchases, and even for the transportation of cotton in areas that were far from markets and convenient purchases. These were all supported by the colonial government. Similarly optimistic was the idea that Korean cultivators would see the sale of cotton as desirable. Throughout the 1910s and 1920s, the sale of cotton through the associations, which you can see here on this graph, it shows the proportion of the harvest as sold through the associations, and each of these lines represents a different province. In most provinces, it rarely exceeded 10 to 30% of the cotton crop being sold through the associations, the sole exception being South Cholla, which even then rarely exceeded between 30 to 50% of the crop being sold, which is still not a huge amount. The difficulties in establishing reliable sales, this was only exacerbated further following the collapse of global cotton prices in the mid-1920s. So on the left here, you can see the price of cotton in Osaka with Indian cotton, American cotton, and Korean cotton, all shown on the three upper lines here. And you can see that the prices start to fall from the mid-1920s and then continue to decline into the 1930s. And this overlaps very closely with the decline in cultivation of upland cotton, the declining acreage, as farmers simply switched to alternative crops, undermining the government general's target of 250,000 hectares of cotton cultivation in the second promotion plan. And so to the extent the cotton cultivators were sensitive to prices in the manner planned by the government general, the collapse in global cotton prices undermined the colonial government's promotion of cotton as a commercial crop. Cotton remained strategically significant target of colonial agricultural policy. However, textile manufacturing, it was still a key industry within Japan. And also, it's not only cotton prices that were falling in the late 1920s, but rice prices also fell significantly during this time, prompting widespread rural unrest in both Korea and Japan. In Japan, one of the consequences of this was that politicians quickly turned to oppose the import of Korean rice in order to protect Japanese farmers. And in Korea, rural indebtedness became a major social and economic issue, prompting the government to fear the radicalization of peasants, and then developing in response to this, the rural revitalization movement, which was the colonial government's response to the rural crisis in Korea, which aimed to stabilize rural incomes by developing new sources of revenue for rural households, rationalizing household budgets, encouraging savings and diligence and thrift campaigns, etc. And this then overlaps with the continued promotion of cotton cultivation into the 1930s, with the announcement of the third cotton promotion plan and its ambitious targets. In part as well, part of this had the aim of relieving the downward pressure on rice by promoting alternative crops to households. And this then also aligned with the rural revitalization movement, which promoted cotton as a new cash crop for poor households, because although the cotton prices were still depressed, the cotton prices were comparatively higher than farmers might find for some other agricultural crops. The third cotton promotion plan, though, with its connection to the rural revitalization movement, it targeted new populations, mainly women, who earned lower wages than men, which then enabled the healthier profit margins amid this period of depressed prices, as well as poorer households who had not previously been a target of colonial agricultural policy. So in contrast to previous years then, when cotton policies assumed that cultivators had access to their own fields, in the 1930s, the semi-governmental organizations start to make explicit provisions for the promotion of joint cultivation of cotton, whereby women and poorer households, they would collectively rent land to cultivate cotton together. In South Gyeongsang province, for example, the Agricultural Association oversaw the formation of 1,200 village-level cotton cultivation groups in order to meet the expanded targets for cotton cultivation. And this map here is from a report from Miryang County, which shows the formation of these multiple groups divided by gender in each village. And you can see here, so the lines, they're kind of faint, but they show each village area, and you can see two, sometimes three of these organizations in each village. And the report actually, it names the list of these cotton cultivation sites, and the names hint at the scattered and sometimes low quality nature of the land being farmed in these projects. Some of the locations listed were along the road and behind the school. So that just gives you a sense of the land being used in these schemes. The other provinces also proposed similar joint cultivation schemes. South Jeolla province announced the establishment of 2,660 joint cotton fields, while South Chungcheong, North Gyeongsang provinces also proposed smaller village-level organizations in order to promote joint cultivation of cotton, operating again beneath the County Agricultural Association. Within these groups, the sale of the cultivated cotton, it remains an important organizational objective. And indeed, the nature of joint cultivation arguably facilitated the promotion of joint sales through the associations, especially when members who had collectively taken out loans to rent these fields in order to repay the loans. They had to then sell the cotton. And indeed, the Miliang report, where that map came from, it concludes with a survey of Korean raw cotton sales in Osaka. So the sale of cotton is still very important. However, in the 1930s, the commercial value of cotton, it becomes just one element within the campaigns, as colonial officials and agricultural technicians promoted the cultivation of upland cotton as part of the broader rural revitalization movement, with its emphasis on diligence and thrift, making use of female quote-unquote surplus labor, promoting better household management, in some cases enforcing savings from the earnings of joint sales, right? And this was very easy because the sales, they were being conducted via the agricultural association. And so it would simply take a cut of the profits and put it into a savings account on behalf of the members of that group, in theory, to enable them to purchase future land. But when the women's groups, one of the justifications was also to prevent the husbands from squandering women's earnings. And so all of these things, these much more intensive interventions in household management are being carried out through the name of the rationalization of agricultural production. And so the expansion of cotton cultivation in the 1930s, it's thus a product of some of these greater controls and interventions over household activity that accompanied the rural revitalization movement. This, I should mention, it only intensifies during the wartime mobilization period from the late 1930s, when we start to see much greater pressure being placed on farmers to increase their cotton cultivation. The cotton technicians started to much more actively encourage greater cultivation of cotton, eventually introducing quotas for the cultivation of cotton, as well as, at the peak of wartime mobilization, the compulsory sale of cotton to the government at fixed prices. Now, the peak of wartime mobilization, it was a shift from earlier years, quite obviously. But what's significant about the changes in the 1930s, too, is that it's the semi-governmental organizations that continue to be the main vehicle by which the colonial government is promoting cotton cultivation, with the agricultural associations acting as an umbrella over these village level organizations, and then reshaping the terms by which rural households are cultivating and selling upland cotton. And so looking at the various iterations then of the cotton associations, it reveals some important aspects of the colonial rural economy. And the implementation of agricultural policies at the local level, and the changing nature of cotton cultivation. Throughout the colonial period, the cotton associations, they established a network that coordinated the distribution of resources in line with Japanese goals. The semi-governmental organizations linked cotton cultivators with the favored seeds, financial capital, and expertise of agricultural technicians who facilitated the cultivation of cotton within the bounds approved by the Government General of Korea, i.e., for the sale and export of cotton as a raw material for industrial textile manufacturing. Here, it's important to note that the definition, right, what counted as an improved seed or a scientific cultivation practice, this was wholly determined by the interests of the textile industry. And it was accessed then only through these semi-governmental organizations, right, defined by the state, and the connection to the government-run agricultural experiment stations and model industrial farms. So while the semi-governmental organizations allowed some cotton cultivators to flourish, they equally restricted cultivation practices that were outside of the colonial government's sanction, restricting or eliminating intercropping, for example. At the same time, this also built up the farmers' dependency on the semi-governmental organizations for access to seeds, fertilizers, and even opportunities to sell some of the resulting crop. What's important, though, is also to recognize that the colonial commitment to capitalism and the commercial sale of cotton, it was always second to the strategic and economic interests of the broader Japanese empire. When cotton prices fell, the colonial government used the semi-governmental organizations again to intervene in the rural economy, to reshape the form of cotton cultivation in the 1930s, promoting the joint cotton cultivation at the village level, a practice which was further enabled by the direct interventions of the rural revitalization movement to actively manage household budgets, savings, and labor allocations within households. So although the cotton associations continue to prioritize the sale of cotton, they're providing mechanisms for the joint cultivation of cotton, funded through collective loans provided to village residents that expanded cotton cultivation further, drawing a wider swathe of the rural population into colonial cotton promotion schemes. And this then shows the growing role of the new state in the rural economy. While liberation, it does bring the end of the colonial government's cotton promotion policies, many of the elements, though, that were introduced through the cotton associations, the dominance of upland cotton, for example, or the role of experts and technicians in improving cultivation, Korea's exposure to global cotton prices, even the cultivation of cotton as a commercial crop for the industrial textile manufacturing. Many of these remain as features in the post-liberation and indeed post-division South Korean economy. So understanding how the semi-governmental organizations worked to establish these aspects in the colonial period, it goes far beyond their role and their reputation as landlord organizations. It thus provides important insights into the legacies of the transformation of colonial agriculture. Thank you very much. I will stop sharing my screen and hand back over to you, Joseph.
Yes. Well, Dr. Stevens, thank you so much for your fascinating presentation. And I recognize it's evening now, 8:42, am I correct? In Edinburgh, we're joining us for, yes, so thanks for making a late night for us to share some of your research. But I welcome now questions from some of our participants. So you can feel free to ask questions using the chat function or the Q&A function. I can see both. And I'll ask questions as they come in. But maybe I'll just ask a brief question just to kind of give people a chance to kind of collect their thoughts. You started the presentation by mentioning that the effort of the colonial state to encourage cotton production was a failure. You used the F word there, failure. And but then the rest of the presentation showed, gave this kind of convincing argument of how these cotton associations played this key role in really transforming people's agricultural practices when it comes to the type of cotton they were growing, the amount of cotton that was grown. So it seems like a tale of success when read from an angle of trying to transform people's everyday practices. So what's the failure aspect? Like I was left wondering a little bit, like what is the ultimate failure then of this?
Yeah, and I mean, this is a tension that we see in a lot of colonial policies. I mean, the failure is in the intended goal, right, to establish Korea as a stable source of raw cotton for the Japanese textile industry and indeed the growing Korean textile industry. This just never happens. And so, yes, like the colonial government, it does have a very strong role, but this isn't always, in the intended manner. A lot of the changes as well, there are, unintended consequences in some of the interactions of colonial policy with farmers' techniques. The colonial government, it also would love to get rid of intercropping, but it just can't. It took forever to figure this out because there's, like page after page of records where colonial officials are saying, oh, intercropping, we should get rid of it. It's really bad. It, reduces the yield. It damages the quality of the cotton that results. It's not as good. But it's too important for a lot of households. And so in the end, you get a lot of these like hedging practices where the colonial government and the agricultural technicians, they're encouraging barley cropping day, or also the importation and the cultivation of new types of barley. So one of the interesting aspects you see in the 1930s, the promotion of French dwarf barley, because it's shorter, so it's not going to get in the way of the cotton plants, and so it allows them to grow better in the intercropped field. And yeah, so there's a lot of attempts to make intercropping better, even though, you know, if agricultural technicians had their way, you know, it wouldn't be necessary for Koreans to eat, but obviously it was, and so there's a failure in that respect as well.
It seemed like it was meeting, or like the charts you were showing, the land production was meeting most of the targets. Were the targets just kind of much lower than they would have hoped? Like they were setting targets low so that they could be met, but
I think the failure really comes in the 1930s. I mean, the final increase in cultivation, that's really coming under the wartime coercion. And so that is not this, you know, happy, mutually beneficial aspect of commercial cotton cultivation. That is coming at immense effort and at contradiction of a lot of the other cultivation schemes where, you know, like the government is wanting to plant a lot of things. So that final increase, that's from the shift in wartime promotion or wartime mobilization strategies.
Got it. So we've had a few different, so great, the questions are rolling in now. We have 4 different questions. So I'll start with the first one. This is from Sydney Sebold, who's one of the students in my modern Korean history lecture course this semester. She asks, why do you think most people know about colonial Indian cotton, but not colonial Korean cotton?
That's a really important question. And that's one of the reasons why I really want to continue this research. I mean, so India, Egypt, America, these are the largest producers of cotton in the world. And Indian cotton, it also had a very important role in the British Empire. And so, to that regard, we see a lot more focus just on British history in the English language scholarship. And so there's that aspect. Like I mentioned, Korean cotton cultivation, it was, it's relatively insignificant on the global scale. However, it's really worth studying because the use of these semi-governmental organizations is quite different from how we see the British colonial governments in Egypt and India. They're often focusing a lot more on more classical forms of mercantile capitalism and colonial capitalism, trying to deal directly with traders and business interests, whereas the interesting feature of the colonial Korean cotton cultivation is this use of the semi-governmental organizations. And one of the interesting differences then, actually in India, the colonial government, it has a very similar project to try and introduce upland cotton, American upland cotton, to India as well. But it essentially fails because the plant, it's not well suited to the local conditions. It's very delicate in the Indian climate. But also part of it, I would argue, is because of the difference, right? There's so much more variety in the Indian colonial example in terms of this like wide sphere of merchants and landlord activity, whereas in Korea, the cotton associations, they play a really strong role in shaping what happens. And so, yes, I think it's something that I would love to see discussed more in comparison to some of these other examples.
Great. All right, thank you, Sydney, for asking that question. The next question comes from Emily Matson. Who's a recent PhD graduate from the University of Virginia, is currently teaching at American University in DC. Says, thank you for your important work. My question is, what important continuities do you see in agricultural practice in Korea under Japanese colonization, which is the focus of your research, and after World War II, both before and after the Korean War? So you spoke to this, I know, a little bit at the end of your presentation, but sure Emily and I'd be curious about this as well. I'm sure many of my audience are, for you to kind of elaborate a little more on some of these post-colonial legacies, continuity.
Yeah, thank you for that, the opportunity to talk more about this, because this is one of the aspects that makes the colonial agriculture really tricky to understand, and that's why I made such a big deal about thinking about this distinction between goals and methods at the beginning of the presentation, because a lot of the changes that are taking place in colonial agriculture, there's an element of colonial policy to them, but then they're also tapping into some more general trends in agricultural production. And this is happening worldwide, right? I'm talking about the promotion of scientific agriculture. And this is, again, like a huge global trend in the late 19th and early 20th centuries as governments around the world, not just in colonial Korea, but in Japan itself, as well as places like France, the United States. They start to devote a lot more interests and money and effort to beginning, projects like agricultural extension, developing improved seed varieties. And so these are some of the important aspects. And this is some of the continuity that continues into the post-colonial period. The governments continue to try and support the development of improved farming, modern farming, and so this is why I think it's really important to trace this process in the colonial period as well, because the farmers who are going along with this, it's not just because they agree that they should, be providing raw materials for the Japanese industrial textile manufacturers. Sometimes, there's a lot of different impulses that get mixed up in this. There are farmers who are, have pre-existing interests in some of the new scientific cultivation practices. And even the scientific cultivation practices as well, they start to change the form of agriculture. There's also a lot more emphasis on commercial agricultural production, like producing crops for sale. And so cotton is the most important one of these, but there's also sericulture and livestock. These efforts, they precede colonization and they continue after it as well. And so that's the aspect that I really want to highlight, because it's these entanglements with the state, they don't disappear after the end of colonization. They just have to get renegotiated under the post-colonial South Korean state, and even the post-colonial North Korean state, where industrial agriculture is very significant in North Korea as well. So yes, it is these aspects and interactions with the state and the role of the state in promoting these new forms of agriculture, where I think we can start to see some of these continuities.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Emily, for that question. Next question comes from Jake Burton, also a student in the Modern Korean History course this semester. He says, as cotton prices collapsed in the 1920s and 30s, where did those 642,000 Cotton Association members go? Did they enter into other agricultural groups? Oh, good question.
So they did, but it's hard to track them. Because what happens in 1926, so prior to 1926, the colonial government, it set up these form of semi-governmental organizations to promote not just cotton, but also improved sericulture, like silk production, as well as livestock rearing, as well as all these other aspects. And they're organized by the type of farming, right, the crop at the beginning. One of the reasons why they get merged into the Agricultural Association in 1926 is that a lot of farmers are doing all of these things, right? Farmers are both growing cotton and weaving silk and rearing cows. And so there start to be a lot of complaints about the overlapping fees and just the obligations and the replication of a lot of these activities in these associations. And so one of the things that the colonial government does is it merges them all together into the Agricultural Association. So these farmers then, they are joining the Agricultural Association, but we can no longer separate them from all the other farmers who had been in the other associations. So it's really hard to say how many cotton cultivators there are from 1926 onwards, especially because membership in the agricultural association, it becomes automatic. And even tenant farmers, if they cultivate over a certain limit of land, they become members. They are required to become members of the agricultural association. So there's probably more members, but they're not all engaged in cotton cultivation. And again, a lot of this as well, we can start to see them popping up in these village level organizations. So we can see that there's still cotton cultivators out there. It's just hard to get a single national number anymore, I'm afraid.
Great. Thanks, Jake, for your question. Next question comes from Will Walkley, another modern Korean history student. Yay. Were the semi-governmental cotton cultivation groups treated differently after liberation, particularly in the North and South? In this past week, referencing the course that he's taking with me, we discussed about agricultural collectivization in North after the Korean War. Were the DPRK's policies somewhat similar to or markedly different from colonial agricultural association? I think it's an interesting question because we talk about this feels very statist, right? That the state is intervening in a very specific way with these governmental associations, semi-governmental associations, these cotton cultivation associations. And yes, there's definitely a heavy state component to how collectivization occurs. Could you speak any more to like possible connections?
Yeah. So one thing I should say, actually, in South Korea, I'll talk about North Korea in a minute, but in South Korea, the cotton cultivation, it really falls off a cliff after liberation. In part, this is because of just the immense effort that the colonial state was putting into cotton cultivation. And so without all of those supports, cotton cultivation recedes to one, if you want to be really economistic about it, you could call it natural level. However, there's another reason in Southern Korea as to why cotton cultivation recedes, and that is in part as a result of the colonial policies, which established cotton as this commercial good. And that is because in South Korea, one of the forms of aid from the United States that is delivered to South Korea is the very or low cost, if not free, import of US aid in cotton, sugar, and flour. And so the cotton cultivation, like it is just economically inefficient to compete with those households. So with the American imports of raw cotton, which are coming at exceedingly low cost. And so cotton cultivation, it continues to some extent. I would be really curious to find out if they're selling the cotton or if they're using it within the household, because that continued to be an important use of cotton even through the colonial period. My guess is it's more household consumption rather than the sale of cotton. But again, this is one of the legacies of the this transformation of cotton into a commercial good. Then yeah, once it's a commercial good and you're competing against the United States imports, then it's very difficult to succeed without the subsidies and support from the government. But the associations, so we're not talking about cotton associations anymore, but we do see a continued role for some of the agricultural associations. This really takes off in the 1960s under Park Chung-hee. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Nonghyup, which is a bank, but it's an agricultural cooperative bank, which essentially takes a lot of the similar roles of the semi-governmental organizations in the colonial period. It distributes resources to farmers, it lends credit to farmers, and it also engages in marketing agricultural products. So that would be the successor on the South Korean side. On the North Korean side, it gets tricky because, collectivization occurs. And so I'm hesitant to say that we can see this like direct organizational continuity like we can in South Korea. However, thinking about the types of agriculture that are taking place, again, this is where we start to see a lot of state support and state involvement in what is being produced. So again, the continuity, it may not be as direct organizational, but in the form of agriculture, the role of science, the role of the state, this then follows through very strongly.
Great. Thank you, Will, for your question. All right, our next question comes from another student, modern history student, Anna Cassell, who asked, so you mentioned intercropping was frowned upon, but a lot of intercropping is actually healthier for the plants and led to better, higher quality yield. Was the negative position of the government, the colonial government, on intercropping due to taboos, different facts they had, or something like misinformation? Or did they just want to make sure that cotton was the main priority?
Kind of your final option there. It was because of the way that they saw cotton. Right? They actually they did studies, and so they actually found that the monocropping of cotton, right, planting it without the barley, led to healthier plants. Again, this all comes down to their definition, and their definition of a healthy, good plant was one with, a higher yield. And so, yes, I mean, if we're looking at the broader ecosystem, like definitely intercropping, we can see that it has a lot of benefits in terms of pest control, and, maintaining some of the soil fertility, but that was not the priority of the colonial government. And so their definition of good was the cotton, but not just cotton, it's commercial production of cotton.
Thank you, and thank you, Annika, for your question. Next, there's a number of questions come to us from Dr. Geeta Patel, who's one of my colleagues here at the University of Virginia, and is professor of Middle Eastern South Asian languages and cultures and women, gender, and sexuality, and she's a longtime participant in our sort of MadCap seminar, it's called, or Studies of Capitalism. So I'm glad she's here to ask some hard-hitting questions. She says, I hope to meet you in Edinburgh. Thank you for a great talk. Can you talk a bit more about, and list a few different things, debt and cultivation, state forms, organizations that impact on households and women's agricultural role and social reproduction, whether there's any synchronicity between practice during the Meiji Restoration in Japan, practice in Korea, solutions for finance. She also asked who weaves, who makes thread, where is this done? You imply this may occur in households when the crop's not sold on. So I think from among those, try to answer as many questions as you can, speak to. I'm sure many of us are wondering some of these same things as well.
Oh, gosh, that's a lot. If you want to be more specific, please feel free to add into that, but I can happily talk about all of these topics for sure. So debt and cultivation, this really becomes an issue. Well, I mean, which form of debt is one of the questions. So like a lot of households become indebted as part of the, or as a result of some of the state encouragement of investment into rice agriculture, specifically rice, because that involved a lot of investment into irrigation. So there is a broader debt problem in the rural economy. This doesn't really get discussed. This doesn't appear as an issue with cotton cultivation, I think in part because, again, of the assumption in colonial policy that the first crop of members of these associations, they are wealthier households who have their own fields. They're either self-cultivators or smaller landlords who are then they have ready access to the fields already. So debt does not come up as a major issue for cotton cultivation because there are very few financial incentives upfront or financial commitments upfront. Right, they're receiving the seeds for free. The credit is for the purchase of fertilizers, but a lot of the fertilizers that are being encouraged by the colonial government, they're actually not the more expensive chemical fertilizers. They're also things like green manure, soybean cake. So they're purchases, but they're lower level purchases than the big debt in the rural economy, which is coming from this investment into irrigation work. And so that's what causes the problem of indebtedness in the late 1920s and early 1930s. The debt for cotton, it really comes in when we're talking about these joint cultivation organizations. And so that's when in the 1930s, we're seeing the poorer households being drawn into cotton cultivation. Ironically, they're the ones being encouraged to take out these loans and debts in order to rent these fields that they otherwise wouldn't have access to. And so that is my sense as to why we see some of the increase in the commercial sale of cotton in the 1930s. There are elements of coercion, of course, when the state is playing a heavier role, but some of this is coming from the sheer necessity of the smaller joint cultivation groups to sell their crop, whereas before, farmers or the landlords and self-cultivators had a lot freer control over what would happen with the crop. This leads neatly into your final question, who weaves, who makes the thread? This is often done in the household, women. Some of the farmers' diaries that I'm looking at, like the women simply spend all winter weaving and sewing and making threads. So this is done within the household, really quite late into the colonial economy, even though like the cloth, manufactured cloth and textiles, they are available and households are buying them. There's still a significant amount of weaving done within the household. I would love to see a study that recognizes that, but I have yet to find that. So I can't say more, but yes, it's done in the household with wives. Often, even in the wealthier families, wives are still playing an important role here, but also hiring female labor from among the broader family. The organizations and their impact on households. This then leads very neatly thinking about how the organizations are changing women's role, because women, they do start to play like a much more active role. And I mean, the cotton cultivation is one of the few areas where we start to see a lot more female activity in cultivation. Women are being encouraged to work partly because of their lower wages. There also some very gendered aspects to this. They're considered, delicate and suited to the task of cotton picking. And so there's actually a song that the colonial government used at the beginning of one of its promotional books, celebrating its work in promoting cotton cultivation in Jindor, an island off the southwestern coast. And this song basically talks about how women are sweating in the fields. So there's a very new aspect to some of the way that the female labor is being encouraged through or being understood and valued through these cotton organizations. It's unclear as to how the women themselves felt about all of this, especially when we get to the joint cultivation through the female-only joint cultivation groups. This is a lot more coerced. And so in the wealthier households, the women are not participating in the fields unless they need to. The female labor is generally, already very busy in managing rural households. So yes, I think, the degree to which this is providing new agency and new savings, obviously we have to take that line from the colonial government with a pinch of salt. But there is a change in the visibility of women in cotton agriculture. Synchronicity between practice, and that then is a result of the state interventions. Is there any synchronicity between practices during the Meiji Restoration in Japan and practices in Korea? For cotton, not so much, because upland cotton was not grown in Japan. However, the forms of these semi-governmental organizations, they're drawing on models from Japan. Japan also has an agricultural association. It also has forms of irrigation association and trade associations. Also, a lot of the knowledge and expertise in the colonial state is also coming from Japanese educational institutions and Japan's own experience of colonization and the use of agriculture in colonization in places like Hokkaido and Taiwan, which have preceded the annexation of Korea. So there are the intellectual and personal connections between the upper figures. There's also the organizational similarities. However, there are some significant differences between the Agricultural Association in Japan and the Agricultural Association in Korea. And this is why I hesitate to go too far in calling it a landlord organization, because in Japan, we can see the Agricultural Association playing quite an active political role for its members, and that is never available for the Korean Agricultural Association. It is very clearly like a part of the state infrastructure. It doesn't have the same political function. There are spaces for Koreans to play a role, but that's always, within some quite strong limits. And is that enough? Associations for finance. So these were the financial associations, Kinyu-kumiai or Kumin-chohap in Korean. They operated as small-scale rural banks, but receiving capital and leadership from the colonial government and colonial officials. They often facilitate a lot of the colonial government's interventions in other agricultural projects. So there's a lot of overlap, and this is why it really is a network between the livestock associations, the cotton associations, the sericulture associations. When these need credit or money, or when the cotton is being sold through the cotton associations, the proceeds go into an account at the financial associations. So it's like an entire infrastructure set up to organize this realm of commercial agriculture. And so there's a lot of overlap in some of the leadership, some of the membership there. I hope that answered your questions. But again, if there was a slightly more specific angle you wanted, feel free to fill that in the comments. And yes, if you come to Edinburgh, it will be very lovely to meet you.
All right, yeah, thank you so much for those questions. Our next question comes from Sally Han. Sally Han is also a member of our Modern Korean History course. She says, I understand our focus is on cotton, but I was curious if silk had undergone similar promotion campaigns. Considering clothing and products such as hanbok, or Korean traditional clothing that use silk, I assume there would be a demand for the use of silkworms from higher classes.
Yes. So I'm less certain about the connection to the clothing and the eventual route of the silk that is produced, but silk too, it was considered a very important commercial crop, and one with high potential. The silk exports were one of the big early agricultural exports from Japan as well, and so this is something that the colonial government again invested significant resources into, quote unquote, improving by importing improved silkworms and distributing them and encouraging the planting of mulberry trees, right, to provide the food for the silkworms. I don't look at them in my actual research, in part because there's too many moving parts with the mulberry trees and the silkworms, but we can see very similar trends. There are sericulture associations, there are sericulture technicians, and eventually these also get put into the get merged into the Agricultural Association in 1926. So again, it wouldn't surprise me if we can see very similar emphases on not just silk, but silk for commercial sales, silk for export. So even though we can, the farmers' diaries that I look at, they're weaving cotton as well as silk in the household. My guess is that the sericulture associations, they are again prioritizing the commercial production of silk. So again, grading it, selling it through these collective associations, making sure that the resulting product is, to the specifications desired by commercial purchasers and producers. Yes. in other words, yes.
All right, great. Thanks, Sally, for your question. And Holly, did you get a chance to see Guido's response here?
Oh, yes.
My partner is a colleague of yours, University of Edinburgh. But,
excellent.
Great. Well, I don't see any other questions in the queue. I think the talk announcement said we go technically up to 4:30, but it's 4:15, and I feel like we've learned so much, and we really have quite a bit to digest. And it's Friday afternoon, and it's late Friday evening for Professor Stevens. So if no one else minds, I think we'll go ahead and call it good here. Send her off with our virtual round of applause and a hearty, sincere thanks for joining us.